And I suppose that's what Queen Elizabeth II represented. You know, many people spoke about her as she represented this kind of staid, but kind of upright, benevolent figure, but someone who believed in following through, setting an example. And that's something that was a connection to the old world, as it were, you know, the pre whenever you want to define maternity, but pre 1960s, I guess. And we don't really see anyone aping those kind of values. I was just speaking with Professor Carl Truman, who is over in the States, but he's an Englishman. He's written a lot about the social imaginary, this idea of all the ideas and values that swirl around in a culture that become popular over time through arts and literature and what people attach status to. And then however long the elites show that they're interested in those things and propagate it, it ends up filtering down. And in the past, there were things that were more useful to people, regardless of your social status, than perhaps now, where there's a lot more of there are no common standards. Everyone's trying to be a bit of a cool parent, as it were. And sometimes I even look at old images of the working class, for example, who are coming out of factories or they're working on railroads. And what I'm always struck by, from the elites right down to the lower ranks of society, is how well dressed everyone is. This idea of wanting to present an appearance. And
respectability, yeah,
exactly. And in the lockdown, you know, I'm logging on to Teams calls, you know, whether it's in a professional environment or not, or even walking around professional offices in the city of London, if I ever go down there, and people are walking around in New Balance trainers, trousers up, socks showing, and shirts open, and it's and they're actually, you know, the anywheres, the middle classes. And I find that quite interesting, you know, athleisure being the thing that CEOs and the like will wear, in comparison to folks who used to comport themselves in a different way. David, I know I probably only got you for a little bit longer, and I want to be able to give some time to your new book, which I think is fair.
Well, actually, there's a good link here, because actually a classic area of where, you know, modern elites behave in one way, but speak in another way, is kind of marriage and the family. I mean, I've just finished writing a book on the partly on the family. It's sort of more broad than it's broader than that. It's about the undervaluing of the domestic sphere in general. I'd say rather grandly, it's a sort of third in my anywhere critique. The first book was a sort of a general critique of the kind of anywhere worldview, and particularly to do with sort of openness and, you know, and migration issues and national identity issues, where there's this big gap between kind of anywheres and somewheres. And the second was on the Head, Hand, Heart book, was more about the overvaluing of just sort of one particular human aptitude, the kind of analytical intelligence, the sort of data, manipulating information and data, and the third, I think, is about the undervaluing of the domestic sphere and the family, and the kind of tension that has emerged between care and sex equality. I mean, I think we've got a kind of, to put it as neutrally as possible, we've got a sort of investment problem. You know, how do we invest enough in, having and raising babies, in, looking after old people and impaired people, in the way that we say that we want, when there are fewer people to do the caring. I mean, partly for good reasons. I mean, this is an area like so many areas of political life where the sort of the positive things and negative things are all sort of tied up together. So, arguably the biggest increase in human freedom since the Second World War has been women's autonomy, women's much greater autonomy, partly inspired by second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, a lot of the big legal changes, and the massive movement of women into the paid workforce out of the family. But that has left a big hole, and there's a sort of false accounting that goes on here. We see only the sort of positive benefit, both culturally and economically, of the movement of women into the paid economy, and we do not see the gap that has been left behind. We've ended up with much smaller and I think weaker families, and that actually means a much bigger state. It's not only the aging society that is piling more and more responsibility and cost onto the state and therefore the taxpayer. We've got the mental fragility epidemic particularly amongst young people, which I think has, notwithstanding, although I think Jonathan Haidt and Jean Twenge and all of the argument about social media and smartphones and so on is clearly a factor. But I think there's a bigger background factor, which is the fact that in the UK today, nearly 50% of kids born this century are not living with both of their biological parents when they do their GCSEs when they're about 16. I mean, that is a huge change. I mean, that number was less than half that 20, 30 years ago.
And what are the social outcomes for kids who grow up?
Well, massively worse for people from either single parent homes, where it's kind of obvious in a way. Obviously, you have less resources, both kind of emotional and financial, to go around if you only have one parent. But those one parent families often started off as two parent families. I mean, the great sort of turmoil of changing faces and places, particularly when children are very young. I mean, John Bowlby's attachment theory that is sort of premised on the idea that at least in the first sort of 2 or 3 years of life, infants need a very high degree of stability and connection, with a primary carer. It doesn't always have to be the mother, although it generally tends to be. It can, and the mother obviously can be supported by other sort of secondary primary carers, if you like. But none of that work has ever really been disproved. Indeed, it fed into quite a lot of British public policy. For example, the closure of lots of children's homes, the preference for fostering over putting children in children's homes, and so on. The way that private boarding schools sort of fell out of fashion. And yet we are about to spend, this government, a Conservative government, the party of the family supposedly, is about to spend, or is in the process of spending, £4 billion extra a year on childcare. Childcare that would encompass infants as young as 9 months, which will also mainly benefit. I mean, clearly we do need a decent childcare system. No one is arguing with that. And despite the fact that we spend a very large amount of money on it, it's still, because of the way that it was originally set up, highly over-regulated in some ways. The kind of carer to child ratios are much higher in certain areas, in certain respects, than in much of the rest of the rich world. So it's too expensive for parents. Nonetheless, investing a huge amount of taxpayers' money in childcare for really, really small infants, the infants who really are in need of a secure relationship with a primary carer, will mainly benefit couples, both of whom are working full time. The number of people that think this is a good way of raising children below school age is like 9%, in British social attitude surveys. This is one of the areas where there's the biggest disconnect between sort of elite opinion or political class opinion and majority opinion. and partly because of the way that political class opinion has evolved, we really don't talk very much about the huge impact of smaller and weaker families on so many areas. I mean, so many social problems have a huge family dimension, whether it's sort of criminal justice, whether it's housing, I mean, you name it, education. Anyway, I'm trying to sort of pull some of these things together in this book. And like I say, I'm going to talk about how weaker families mean a bigger state. There's this knock-on effect, I think, it's a big background factor in the mental fragility epidemic. And of course, we had the falling birth rate. It's another huge factor, partly created by the greater insecurity of modern relationships, not to mention obviously things like housing and of course this is a very international phenomenon, the falling birth rate. But I think it's a rich country phenomenon where we put a kind of short-term idea of freedom ahead of the things that really do give us long-term sort of happiness and satisfaction in life. And I think that it's very difficult to deal with forces that are kind of, as it were, satisfying people in the kind of immediate short term. When someone put it quite well the other day that we're pro-child but anti-natalist. I mean, that's partly to do with the kind of intensive parenting, over-intensive parenting in some ways. I mean, Jonathan Haidt talks about how that we kind of over-regulate children in the real world and we under-regulate children in online. I think he has definitely captured something there. But the idea that life as a childless individual has, even somebody on, say, of average wealth, on average earnings, the kind of the quality of life for the average person in a rich country has increased enormously, I think, in the last 30 or 40 years. You just sort of think of, things like smartphone, our connectivity, the kind of access that you have to, the cheap travel, the, Netflix. I mean, the kind of entertainment possibilities, the sort of food, our obsession with ever more sophisticated forms of food. And, there are so many more things we can do with our time. Parenting, which is a very difficult and time consuming and boring thing, has, if anything, got harder. So, if you're only measuring, as it were, sort of short-term satisfaction, you can see why birth rates have tumbled and why they're going to go on tumbling. And it probably does require, I mean, there are lots of things the government can do. I mean, we have, just talking about it as a problem, which of course it is. I mean, it's a huge economic problem, because as all these sort of dependency ratios start to shift against us, more and more retired people per worker, and that means more and more taxes on the smaller and smaller number of people who are doing productive work. And as we've just been talking about, immigration is not solving the problem. If anything, it's making it worse. A small amount of the right kind of, what Neil O'Brien talks about the sort of grammar school type immigration, where you're highly selective, might help. But to compensate for we've had a below replacement birth rate for more than 50 years now. It's likely to be heading down further. We're below 1.5, 2.1 is replacement. To turn that round is going to be very, very difficult. And immigration, the rate of immigration you would require to keep the age structure more or less as it is now becomes absolutely enormous very quickly. So it really isn't an option. I mean, of course, we can raise the retirement age. I mean, there are things that can be done. But so, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of trying to bring all of these things. Well, and the other kind of factor, which isn't so directly to do with the family, but you could say it's to do with the kind of ideas of sort of care and nurture that sort of derive from the family, is the recruitment crisis in public economy care jobs, in both in elder care and in nursery care. So if you all of those four things, I think, are, the smaller and weaker family, the mental fragility epidemic, the falling birth rate, the recruitment crisis in care jobs, are all expressions of the undervaluing of the domestic sphere, and sort of the putting of freedom first, or a kind of shallow idea of freedom, I think. And I think we're particularly bad in this country in some ways. We do not, we have a very anti-natalist public policy. We have this welfare limit on 2 children. We don't support the family in the tax system. And there are some very simple things you could do to make it easier for families to stay together, particularly in that sort of high stress period of, when children are very young and often work responsibilities are at their most intense. And one thing that would be very popular would be to basically pay people to stay at home and look after their children at that point. Make that a respectable paid thing to do. There could be a kind of home care allowance, as some other countries already have. And actually, it wouldn't be hugely costly, because you could sort of package together quite a lot of the money that's already being spent. We spend, as I said earlier, a huge amount on childcare. Why not give that to individual families rather than having it sort of top down at the moment, paid by government through the nursery system? If you did that, and you did, and you can, if you front-ended child benefit, so that families could get 3,000 or 4,000 quid a year in child benefit, rather than the kind of bit more than 1,000 quid you get at the moment, and then have it extending for less long into, you can go on getting it till a child is 16 or even 20 at the moment. You could front end child benefit. You could give childcare direct to parents. You could introduce, this would cost a bit of money, but you could introduce a proper family tax allowance that almost all other rich countries have, but we don't. So we're particularly bad, and we're not talking about the falling birth rate as a problem in a way that quite a few other rich countries are. France has always been, certain since it got overrun in 1870 by a more populist Prussia, it's been very conscious of the necessity of keeping your birth rate up. So, Macron has been giving speeches about this recently, but, and I think the economics will force us to start worrying about this much more publicly than we have been so far.